When people talk about the welfare system, they often mention things like, say, for example, the EITC brought 2.7 million children out of poverty in 2002. But these comments are all based on income at the household level and don't take into account the allocation of resources within the household. We also have when we think about the welfare of low-income people in the US and children in the US, we also talk about how many children there are in poverty. And again, same story, we don't take into account the intra-household allocation. This is all based on income at the household level. So the aim of this project is to quantify the effects of welfare programs on the household resources allocated to children, but also to estimate poverty levels taking into account the intra-household allocation. Okay, so this is how my work sort of fits into the literature. We know that there's a very strong relationship, correlation between income and child outcomes. And a number of papers recently have tried to estimate the causal effect of income on child outcomes, looking at things like variation in the tax and welfare system to instrument for parents' income. But if we were to go within the black box of what's happening under these, or what's happening under the mechanisms underlying these reduced form estimates, there's basically two stages to this relationship. Firstly, the way that income affects parents' decision making and the way that they allocate resources within the family. And then secondly, the way that those resources then translate into child outcomes. So there's been a lot of work which has looked at this idea of a child production function within the household. So, but there has been little work looking at this first mechanism, and that's where my research comes into play. So my contribution, I'm going to be estimating a structural model of intra-household decision-making, a static model, where parents allocate time and consumption to children. The children benefit from the production of a public good. And I'm also going to be exploiting much exogenous variation in the tax and welfare policy over this period, which saw, say, the introduction of TANF and also the Bush tax cuts as sort of the backdrop to my structural estimation, so that I've got some source of variation in income that's plausibly exogenous. Okay, so to actually estimate this model, there's a challenge because disaggregated time use and consumption data is not available in one data set in the US. So there is a Dutch data set which does have this kind of information available, but the data set's very small. So the one paper that has actually estimated the collective model in previous literature has only 200 observations, whilst I'm going to be exploiting I think it's over 6,000 observations in the ATUS, and the Consumer Expenditure Survey has 2,000 that's in the sample of couples. And I'm also using the survey of income and program participation to try and model childcare costs. Okay, so the tax and welfare programs I'm going to be including, so this is just I'll just go through this quickly. It's the US tax and welfare system is quite piecemeal and complicated. So we have, firstly, at the federal level, taxation, deductions and exemptions, the earned income tax credit, the child tax credit, food stamps, and the child and dependent tax care credit. And then at the state level, taxation, deductions and exemptions, the EITC, the aid to families with dependent children, which then in 1996 was replaced with temporary assistance for needy families, and then also the state child and dependent care tax credit. Okay, so just to, these policies are, if you were to look at the amount of the welfare budget allocated to various items that benefit children, these are really the big ticket items in terms of cash welfare. So then if we want to think about, have a look at how these policies are varying over our time period, you can see, so this these plots here show the weekly benefit for a two-parent, two-child family. And you can see that, for example, the EITC increased from $35 in 1993 to around $75 in 1996 through to 2012. We also see quite a lot of variation in the child tax credit, obviously in AFDC and TANF, and also in food stamps.
Is that all in real terms?
Yeah. $2,000. So here what I've got is the change in the weekly net transfer from the tax and welfare system from 1993 for a two-parent, two-child family. And basically you can see that firstly there is quite a lot of variation across time, but due to the state policy variation in my sample, you can also see that there's quite a lot of variation across different states. For example, in Nebraska, as the time through my time period, taxes became more generous for high-income people were taxed less, whilst in Delaware, the opposite was happening in comparison to the big states like California and New York. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the structural model I'm going to be estimating. So for couples, I'm going to be estimating a collective model where it's assumed that parents bargain and reach a Pareto optimal outcome, where lambda is the bargaining power of the mother. So for each parent, their utility is simply a weighted sum of their own private utility, which is a function of their private consumption, their leisure, and the public good, and also a constant multiplied by what I call the child utility function, which is a function of the child's private consumption, time with each parent, and the quantity of the public good. Lambda is varies with distribution factors such as the sex ratio and the wage ratio. And so basically what happens is parents choose to allocate time between market work, housework, time with children, and leisure. And then in sole parent households, we simply have the same specification for UI without the bargaining. So the parent's utility function is just simply this form here. I actually started out with a more complicated utility function, but the data didn't warrant, the estimates didn't seem to be affected by that. So this seems sufficient to describe the variation in the data in the structural estimation. And then for the children's utility, I have a nested CES where, so this basically, the time for both parents is nested into this function here. So this allows us to look at the complementarity of parents' time. And then finally, the public good production function is also CES. So the budget constraint is as follows. So we've just basically got the private consumption of each household member. This here is the amount that the household has to spend on childcare, where this is basically the amount of time that the parents so it's the minimum of the hours of work of the mother and father, which, so this is like the time deficit for which there's no parent around to supervise the child. This is estimated as the amount of free available childcare time from family members, and then this is the amount of time that they're in school. This is the price of childcare per hour for children over 5 and the number of children over 5. So all of this information is taken from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. And then similarly here for the number of children under 5. Sorry, this is for over 5. And here we have the tax and wealth, the tax function, which incorporates all those programs I discussed previously. And Y here at the end is DIS savings. This is constructed according to Blundell and Walker 1987. And so I'm going because it relates to this savings. There is some. I am able to interpret some of my estimates in terms of in a life cycle framework, and I'm going to be supplementing this work with simulations in that of life cycle framework, so that I can talk about this in a more general framework. Great. And then we have time constraints, time budget constraints, obviously, and I estimate hours worked as being discrete. This is quite common in the non-linear budget set literature due to the complications with estimating with continuous hours when you have non-convex budget sets. Okay, so as I've mentioned previously, I can't take the objective function, take a first order condition and estimate that because of the data belongs in two different data sets. So I have to use...
Is this a static model?
Yes, yes.
And then, so you're going to look at a large age group. I mean, which age group this static model will correspond to? You will look at everybody?
Yeah, so it's all households where with two parents or one parent, no grandparents, nothing else, and then children under the age of 18.
And they are heterogeneous in terms of underlying heterogeneities in wages there.
Yes, but then there's also a lot of my parameters are allowed to vary with, say, the number of children and all that kind of.
Number of children and age of children, incomes, those are
education.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I can do, so basically, if you look at the demand equations from this model, you can see that the variables that appear in the different data sets all appear here on the left-hand side, which allows me to estimate this model using a method of moments. So basically, so tau here is my parameter vector, and I simulate these eta to estimate these demand functions because there's no closed form solution for the demand function, so that has to be computed numerically. Okay, so it's actually a little more complicated than that. So there's also a first stage estimation where I have to estimate the processes for the wages, non-labor income, and the childcare parameters. And this is basically because I'm using the data is not available in the same data set, and also, of course, we've got censoring because women don't work. And I've done an out-of-sample fit for the model, and the overall fit appears reasonably good. It does seem to match changes with changes between these two periods. In, say, in parents' time use. So, for example, there's an increase in parents' time use between this estimation period and the out-of-sample period, and the model seems to match that. Okay, so there's an additional problem because, as you can imagine, with the consumer expenditure survey, I do not have assignable goods. So I'm going to have to use some of the techniques that have been adapted previously to divide total private consumption into private consumption for each family member by using an assignable good. So basically what I need to determine, so CI here is the total private good for member I, and then so there's some function, some aggregator function that determines how this is the relationship between this and all the disaggregated goods, for example. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the Dumbbell, Lubell, and Pentaker. They use a SAP restriction, which implies that preferences are in a certain respect are similar across people. So what that basically implies is that the preferences over this function here must be of a pig log nature. It also implies that there's also an it also implies that there's angle curves. The budget share is a linear function relating the total. So there are other restrictions which don't quite apply here, but because I'm going to be using the average and using this as a moment, the linear angle curve is not going to be too much of a problem. Sorry, I can, if you want to know more about the details of that, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. And so basically for each household size, I estimate this function here where this is the assignable good, this is total consumption, and then what we get is this coefficient here where eta I is the share of total consumption going to the member I, and then that basically can be backed out via this function here. Okay, so now, so that's all the estimation. So these are the results. So firstly, I'd like to talk about the labour supply elasticities. So we know that there's a, in these models, there's a number of mechanisms that are operating. So firstly, there's so we can think about the Marshallian elasticity, which is where we don't change the amount of income from that the family gets from the wage. We can think about the total elasticity, which does incorporate the change in the wage and how that influences income, and then the bargaining power effect. So these elasticities, so I guess the main thing to note is that there's quite a lot of compensation from the mother in terms of an increase in the father's wage, especially once you start taking into account the bargaining power and the total income effect.
So what do you mean by the bargaining? So how should I interpret?
Okay, so there's a female to male wage ratio in the bargaining power. So there's an additional effect through that of each wage. Okay, so we can also think about how, so this is again the bargaining power elasticities, and we can think about how the choices over time with children and housework respond to changes in the mother's and father's wage.
And these elasticities are the extensive margin mainly. How should we interpret them?
Intensive margin.
So,
Why?
So you have R's choice continuous.
No. I have discrete hours choice, but I allow that people can switch across nodes. Switch across hours choices when you change. Yeah. So for example, you change the wage, and then the family might there is a friction there, but then like maybe on average in the population, you might think that it's somehow continuous. Maybe I'm not sure. So I think the interesting thing to note here is that you can see that housework is actually much more responsive to the wage than time with children is. And then if we actually go to think about the elasticity of the child utility function and the home production function with respect to the wages, you can see that home production is much more elastic with respect to the wages and non-labour income than the child utility function is. So this has implications for, and which I haven't quite yet drawn out, but it has implications for if we want to think about how a family might respond to wage shocks, or they might, and it seems this would suggest to me that taking into account home production seems to be more important than taking into account child utility when we want to think about the insurance mechanism or labour supply effects within the household when we want to incorporate the effect of the household environment. And then finally, you can see that these are the derivatives of parents' time with children with respect to non-labour income, and they're quite different across. And you can see also that they're positive, so we have an increase in time, but it's very small. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about the counterfactual policy experiments. Perhaps this is the more interesting part. So the first thing I do is I examine the effect of taking out and then reintroducing each welfare program. The idea being that I want to look at how the allocation of resources to children changes, and then how I can quantify that in monetary terms. So I use a compensating variation measure. So I won't go into that, but basically you can see that cash welfare, it's somewhat effective in allocating resources to children. For example, the EITC, we see that about 2/5 gets through to children. The CTC, it's about 1/3. And it also, these values seem to be very consistent across programs. So that would, yeah. And then the total effect here, this is from taking out and reintroducing all welfare programs. So this implies that about 30% of spending on government welfare programs translates into tangible resources allocated to children within the household.
Have you perhaps looked at that by age? I can't remember if there's an age of children in your model.
Yeah, there is. I haven't looked at that by age, but that's certainly something I could do.
Because you could kind of focus it on early childhood development vis-a-vis schools.
Yeah.
And it might be interesting to see if these programs affect more the kind of early investments vis-a-vis later.
Yeah, so the increase, so there is a question about whether the increase in parents' time is good for cognitive development, and I have done previous work which has tried to relate the increase in parents' time to child test scores. The increases in parents' time with children do not seem to be large enough to really warrant, and the resulting increase in test scores doesn't seem large enough to sort of warrant a comparison with, say, Head Start or something like that. In previous versions of this paper it did, but the more recent estimates don't have that.
So your production function is kind of static, is that right?
Yes.
So when you say you remove this program, is that just the contemporaneous effect of that, or the lifetime effect?
Yeah, so basically because I use the Blundell and Walker DIS savings, I'm taking out and reintroducing these programs while keeping savings constant. So if you think that, say, for example, the introduction of EITC wouldn't change savings that much, or might change, or at least, so if you sort of switch to a new regime where EITC is, say, more generous, then you might think, then if you think that the amount that they get every single period for the rest of their life will be spent in that period, which is consistent with some very simple models or macro models, then you would think, this does have implications for an intertemporal model. I do in future work want to consider how savings might change just by doing some simple simulations. But I think there's probably quite a strong argument that you are switching to a different regime and spending that amount, or most of that amount, every period.
So that doesn't capture the early investment part in child development and the growth in that. You talk about the other savings, but I just wonder, given that your model doesn't necessarily capture that experience of being exposed to the EITC at a younger age.
Yeah.
Versus now, I wonder, what you're capturing here. Is that?
Okay, so I mean, my model is flexible enough to estimate how allocation of resources to children might change given the age of children. So I can definitely run these experiments and look at that. The models does seem to suggest that parents' time with children is more productive for younger age groups. So that's definitely something I could look at. Okay, so welfare programs are often characterized by how many children they bring out of poverty. For example, in this government paper in 2004 claimed that the EITC alone brought 2.7 million children out of poverty in 2002. But these estimates don't account for behavioural responses and the intra-household allocation of resources. So first, I'd like to start by thinking about how we can construct a child poverty analogue of the official poverty measure. So the official poverty measure is just based on before-tax income. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to construct this CS variable, which is going to be child consumption with the amount of consumption allocated to the child within the household, divided by total consumption. And then because obviously there's a relationship between consumption and before tax income, I'm just going to adjust that to make it in terms of before tax rather than after tax income. So the child consumption share can be written as this function here, where we have the private consumption good allocated to the child plus the public good multiplied by the Lindahl price of the child for the public good of the child, and then the sum of all agents in the household's Lindahl prices. And then total consumption is simply the sum of consumption across all private consumption and the public consumption. And then finally, I multiply the official poverty measure by this function here, and it's denoted by bar CS. So this kind of gives us an idea, firstly, of how much of the consumption good is going to the child across all households, and then secondly, so it's basically a fraction of the amount of a fraction of the official poverty threshold that we might think from the model is allocated to the child. To look at the number of children in poverty, I take the proportion of children for which this measure is less than the mean measure for the whole sample of this CS bar. For children in deep poverty, it's simply the proportion for which it's less than half of this CS bar. And then extreme poverty, this is the number of children under $2 per day. Again, because we're going back to dollars from the amount from before tax income, so this is equivalent to the amount of money that the family has rather than what they had before taxes, so I do this adjustment here. And then finally, I find that the number of children in poverty is 25%. The number of children in deep poverty is 7%, and the number of children in extreme poverty is 2.5%. So this is actually a little higher than the amount of children thought to be in poverty in the US, which is about 20%. Okay, so finally, I can also think about how the various welfare programs are changing the amount of children that are in poverty by, again, looking at the intra-household allocation of resources to children. And now to do this, I've actually constructed a different poverty measure, which is actually a relative poverty measure and based on the ideas of the supplemental poverty measure by the BLS, with an intra-household feel, I guess. So if we just define total consumption for each member of the household as simply as this here, which is just their private consumption plus the price, the Lindahl price multiplied by the private good, then what we have is full income for the mother and father is simply this consumption good plus their leisure time. This wage is not this is the wage that would, this is actually the decentralized price of parents' time, not the actual wage. And then similarly, for the child, we can derive something of a similar nature. And then what I do is I take the 33rd percentile of this across the population for all two-child household and then adapt according to the Benson equivalence scales. Okay, so basically what I find is that the number of children, so firstly I look at these results compared to the official poverty measure when we take into account the behavioral responses. Then what I do is I construct my 33rd percentile intra-household measure based on full income. So this basically includes the amount of time allocated to children as well as the consumption good. And here we can see that the estimate is that about 4% of children are brought out of poverty by all US tax and welfare programs. And then when we focus just on the consumption part, so that's just the total child private good plus the Lindell price multiplied by the public good, the amount of the public good, we can see we have a very similar measure for the amount of children brought out of poverty. And so this actually corresponds to 3 million children brought out of poverty by the full tax and welfare system. But if you think about how that compares to the previous estimates, which took into account the 1.2 million children brought out of poverty by the EICC, so that was based on income at the household level, you can see here that this is about 1.6 million children. So that, this corresponds to about 1 million children. So when you take into account the intra-household allocation, these welfare programs are not as effective as they are when you think about them in terms of their full income. Yeah?
Just clarify the table, which columns should we be comparing? So what's the official column?
Okay, sorry. This is the official poverty measure. So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, so we've got this official poverty measure out there. How many households go from below to above the official poverty measure when I take out and reintroduce these welfare programs? But then I've also constructed my own poverty measures, which are relative poverty measures, which I described, which on the previous slide.
The government estimates of how many come in and out of poverty on this table?
No. So the reason why they're different is because they take into account behavioural responses. So when you introduce so I think the EITC, there are obviously labour supply effects there. But
So is one way to read this to say if you apply your methodology for moving in and out of poverty, but with their measures of who's in poverty, is that the official column? Then you have various...
No. So the official column is based on the model. So it's just basically the official poverty measure and asking in my simulations how many households are brought out of poverty. This is exactly the same experiment, except it's with the my versions of poverty measures, where we so this is where we take for children we take into account the intra-household allocation of resources, and we measure. So the difference between the two is basically that the full income includes parents' time with children. The consumption one doesn't.
So basically, let's try to understand this. So that minus 1.71, that means that because of the earned income credits, there are more children in poverty if you just look at the official line?
Yes, but then this is based...
Because of the kinks, there is decline in the labor supply.
Well, what happens... Yeah, EITC increases, especially for sole parent households, increases employment. So that should decrease the...
That could, earned income tax credit has some negative labor supply effects, especially on the married female labor supply. It can have.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I'm not all that confident in these estimates. But I would, I think that's what's happening. I have to have a look.
Otherwise, it's hard to.
It's hard to understand. I have a feel. So there's a problem in trying to construct something similar to the official poverty measure for children. So so the idea is to think about. So on the previous two slides, I showed one way of doing it.
In your behavioral response thing, you have the full production function, right?
Yeah.
So as women are moving from out of work in work because of the incentive,
yeah,
there's probably a big drop in the time allocated to kids.
But this doesn't take into account time. This is the problem. I would not
What you said would be if we had a negative number in the second.
But the real question is how do you say how much of the before tax poverty threshold goes to children? And I did that in my previous slides. Sorry, this is done in a different manner, which is wrong. So I would just please don't.
Because I think Gustav's point explained the difference between your second and your third column.
Yeah.
So the fact that if you just look at consumption, you have a large impact, but if you take into account the fact that going in the opposite direction, there is a decrease in the time, then that's why the 121 is less than 160.
Yeah, definitely. So the EITC and the CTC have.
There must be something fishy.
Yeah, just please ignore that column. Okay. So finally, something of there's the official poverty measure, which is actually used a lot in terms of determining whether people are eligible for welfare programs. But more recently, the Bureau of Labour Statistics has come up with a supplemental poverty measure, which can be very generally described as equivalent to after-tax earnings. So the interesting thing is when I compare these measures and I look at number of hours worked, especially for singles, and production of the public good, you can see that for the official poverty measure, people just above the threshold work a lot more than people below the threshold, and so as a result, they have less household production. And so they're actually, in terms of consumption, worse off. Whilst when we look at the supplemental poverty measure, we can see that we see the opposite thing. So people above the threshold are working less than people below the threshold. So this is especially apparent in single-parent families, and they're, in terms of consumption good, they're better off. So yeah, there's a kind of questions about. So I mean, it's obvious that the official poverty measure, official poverty threshold, does not incorporate time poverty, and how that might affect a single mother's ability to produce, say, all kinds of household goods. Okay, that's it. There's a conclude. Yeah. Sorry, that should be 30%. Yeah, around 30% of spending on welfare programs translates into resources allocated to children. Cash welfare seems somewhat ineffective in targeting resources to children. The official poverty measure poorly reflects household consumption, and so I actually updated these estimates this morning, but welfare programs bring about 3 million children out of poverty. So, okay.
So did you try, suppose you take one of these programs, you shut it down and you transfer the money to another program, do you have the technology to do that, and then to see which program would be more effective? Suppose we shut everything and put the money to earned income tax credit, or put all the money to food stamps type of programs. Can your model tell something about that?
Yeah, sure. There's definitely that possibility. The question is how you would shape you could just scale it up, I guess, and do a net benefit. I have done some counterfactuals where I have sort of kept the net amount spent after behavioural response is constant, but I could definitely look at that.
Do you have a sense which programs are more effective?
Well, if you looked at the results, they did suggest that they were, in terms of the amount of money going through to children, they are pretty similar. Okay. I do know that the interesting thing is that. How
do you conclude that it's similar?
So this is the compensating variation measure. So what I do is I take out and reintroduce the program, and basically what I do is I say, okay, so when the program's in place, the child has this amount of utility. What do I have to do when the program's not in place? How much money do I have to give to that child directly to make them as well off when the program's not in place as when it is in place? And I also so all of that, so basically the child can buy time from the parents and the consumption good at all the decentralized prices. So that's the Lindahl price of the public good and wages for parents. So there doesn't seem, the interesting thing here, which isn't on this slide, is that it's about 50% of spending on the EITC and CTC gets through to children in sole parent families. So we might think that sole parent families are more effective in allocating resources to children. Spending on cash welfare programs might be more effective in sole parent families than in couples. Yeah.
Since you have extra time, I have a policy question. So it seems like when you take into account inter-household allocation, there's two problems. One is that some of the money you think is going towards children, that you're targeting these households, and some of the money is not actually getting through to children because it's in effect being taxed by parents, right? But there's also a sort of allocation problem, which is that you're missing some children that actually are in poverty, and they're in poverty because they're not getting a big enough share of household resources, but you're not identifying them as families that actually sort of need help because the families are above the official poverty measure, right? So my question is, given sort of what you've found, would it ever be possible to reach those children? Because those same children that are in poverty just because of reasons of inter-household allocation, are they the children where their parents are going to tax at such a high rate that just spending is going to be extremely inefficient if you could actually identify, hey, there's some extra children in poverty and give them money, would it just be super inefficient to try to?
Yeah, well, this actually just suggests that it wouldn't be, because the CTC is for the full population, right? So you can see that so here, about a third of spending on the CTC gets through to children. For the EITC, it's quite similar, and the EITC is for low-income people. The same with SNAP. So I would think that if you were to sort of take money from the CTC and try and give it to, and try and scale up the EITC or SNAP, I think it possibly could be quite effective. And yeah, so you could bring more children out of poverty. Yeah?
When you were looking at time poverty, or sort of the full income, so you had the couples and then you had the singles. So whose time is available in the single household? Do you have them, do you have access to extended families?
No, this is all, I have taken out all households in my data set that live with grandparents or live with Yeah, that's true. So I could actually, so in my model I do estimate, sorry, if I go back to the budget constraint. So here I estimate A, which is the amount of free childcare available. I could also try and see whether sort of supplement this with information on maybe, I don't know, I guess if, we might think that if this is composed of grandparents, which is identifiable from the PSID, then we might think that, okay, the grandparent is around, we could get some sense of how many sole parents, into how many sole parent households are grandparents contributing. I'm sorry?
Is that a parameter that's then a constant, like 30, or is it adjusting to the
This is not changed in the experiment, so it's something that's estimated in a first stage with a quite complicated procedure, but it varies with regions and demographics, and that's sort of fitted into the model.